to UCLA Library and today's program. My name is Susan Anderson. I'm the curator of Collecting Los Angeles for the library. My colleague Jane Collings in the beautiful spring jacket from the Library Center for Oral History Research is going to be moderating today's panel with me. But before we introduce the panel, I just want to mention a couple of things, please. The title of today's panel discussion is A Chaos of Creativities. And that's a phrase that we stole from James Boyer May, who was the editor of Trace magazine. And in 1958, this is a Los Angeles-based magazine that's actually on display in the exhibit that we have downstairs. This is a phrase he used, a chaos of creativities, to describe an LA poetry scene that's characterized by intense individualities. And I think probably what he said in 1958 holds true today. At least we'll explore that a little. This program, I'd like you to know, is part of an immersion of programs. The overall title is I'm a Stranger Here Myself. I'm a writer, so I'm a great thief. And I also took this from a wonderful poem by Don Gordon called At the Station. This series of programs on Los Angeles is on Los Angeles and poetry in the Beat era. I think there are flyers somewhere. Thank you. And so please pick those up. The way that we are able to participate in this series is that someone very special who is here today, and I am going to ask her to stand up, came to me and asked me if I would be willing to partner up with the Center for the Art of Performance in association with the performance of Allen Ginsberg's Kaddish, which is actually tomorrow night at Royce Hall. I'd like to introduce Meryl Friedman with the Center for the Art of Performance because she is the one that planted the seed that led to all the things we're involved in. So just stand up. Thank you so much, Meryl. Thank you, Susan. And I'd also like to mention that Richard Modiano, the executive director at Beyond Baroque, has also been a wonderful partner. And you'll see on the flyer that Beyond Baroque is hosting several programs, and the next one is Saturday, April 27th. And it is, when I met S.A. Griffin yesterday, I realized what an extravaganza it's going to be. It's called, after the famous Lawrence Lipton novel, Holy Barbarians, and there's just going to be all kinds of things going on, right? Not just readings, but so I would like to invite people to participate in that as well. Part of our task with Collecting Los Angeles is to help fill in the gaps of knowledge regarding Los Angeles's hidden history. And I would say that when it comes to talking about literature in the post-war era, it's widely recognized that New York and San Francisco were important centers for literary experimentation, but a lot less is known about Los Angeles. And one of the things that I've learned in doing research around these programs is that Los Angeles was a hugely creative, productive, and diverse hub of new literary activity starting in the 1940s. And also that talking about beat literature is only one way of understanding what was going on. So today we're very fortunate to have a group of people who not only have ideas about all of this and are scholars of this, but who in their various ways have a personal connection to this history. And I'd like to introduce Jane because she's going to introduce them to you now. Thanks very much.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to introduce the panel. First of all, Bill Moore is the founder of Momentum Press in 1974. His anthologies have contributed to what has been called a golden age of Los Angeles poetry. He has written on the beat scene in LA in his book Holdouts, The Los Angeles Poetry Renaissance, 1948 to 1992. Wanda Coleman is known as the unofficial poet laureate of Los Angeles, has published over 20 books of poetry. She's one of the last surviving members of Bud Schulberg's Watts Writers Workshop, and she has been an Emmy-winning scriptwriter and was a columnist for Los Angeles Times Magazine. Estelle Gershgorin-Novak is the editor of Poets of the Non-Existent City, Los Angeles in the McCarthy era. Her poetry has been published widely, and her most recent book is Lot's Wife and Other Poems. Julia Stein's work ranges from love lyrics to explorations of war, peace, women's lives and work. She has written about the Central American wars of the 80s, about teaching in South Central in 1992, and her most recent book of poetry deals with the Iraq War. Richard Modiano, as was mentioned, is the director of Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center in Venice, California. He's a poet and an editor, and has served as general secretary of both the New York City and Los Angeles general membership branches of the Industrial Workers of the World. Unfortunately, the last panelist, Paul Evangelisti, could not join us today due to an illness, but allow me to say something about him. He's the founding chair of the graduate writing program at Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles, the author of some 20 books of poetry. And he has also worked as a journalist at The Hollywood Reporter and as cultural affairs director at KPFK Radio. So now that we all know each other, we can begin. If people would be kind enough to keep questions in mind for the panelists, that would lead us to a lively discussion afterward. Afterward, please also stay for a reception and for a book sale and signing event. Let me just sort of kick things off with a first question for the panel. How would you describe the immediate post-World War II era for poets in Los Angeles? Were there distinctions between the new forms of writing that were being generated here compared with San Francisco, New York, Black Mountain College? And please give us your view of the role that McCarthyism played in this environment. And Estelle, would you be kind enough to begin?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Poets after World War II in LA, even though the San Francisco poets saw themselves as anti-establishment poets, separating themselves from the conventional poetry, which was, so did the Black Mountain Group, and so did the LA poets. The question is, of course, how they approached this. And what was interesting from a historical and academic point of view is that the academic establishment had decided that the only really important poets in the history of poetry were T.S. Eliot. And they sort of eliminated everybody else. And especially wanted to get rid of Walt Whitman because he was radical. And radical poets were dangerous. So this especially happened, of course, in a period when everyone was terrified of the great communist menace. So what you had in Los Angeles was an interesting development because a group of poets came here who came here partly because there were jobs here. You know, there were jobs in Hollywood, and that's why people came. There were jobs for musicians, there were jobs for writers, and you know about the famous writers who came, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Faulkner. And other people came in the 50s to find housing. But people had been coming from the 30s to escape the Nazis. So there were people coming to California, even though it appears to be a wasteland. Even when I was growing up, it appeared to be a wasteland. You had people coming here for work and to escape the problems of the East. So most of these writers that I know were coming from other places. There were a few who grew up here, but most people came out of another place and another time, and some of them went back there and some of them stayed. But LA was a place which we think about as Tinseltown because it was Hollywood. But in fact, the films of the earlier period of the 30s and 40s were really powerful movies. You know, it wasn't tinsel-y at all. And some of the people who came here as poets were actually working in Hollywood. So when I was researching the period, which I grew up in, you know, I was just a kid, but I knew all of these people through my father. I can tell you later about that. But people like Don Gordon worked as a reader of novels to suggest whether they would be good for scripts for the movies. So he was the head of the Readers Union, they called it. Not the Script Writers Union, but the Readers Union. And not the Script Readers Union, they were separate. And then Tom McGrath actually worked in Hollywood movies. Ed Rolfe worked for the movies. And anybody who could find a job there worked the movies. So this brought the attention, of course, of the McCarthy people. I call it the McCarthy people. It's really the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, which came to Los Angeles and was headed by a man named Jackson, who did all the questioning. So that people were coming to investigate poets, teachers, screenwriters, actors, directors, and you know about the famous people who were before the committee. One of the poets who most influenced me and whom I knew, Tom McGrath, was brought before the committee in 1953. And if I could I read what he said to the committee? Because I think it's significant because it's a literary statement. It's really not a political statement at all, but it's a political statement. Thirdly, as a poet, I must refuse to cooperate with the committee on what I can only call aesthetic grounds. The view of life which we receive through the great works of art is a privileged one. It is a view of life according to probability or necessity, not subject to the chance and accident of our real world, and therefore, in a sense, truer than the life we see lived around us. Then, too, poets have been notorious non-cooperators where committees of this sort are concerned. As a traditionalist, I would prefer to take my stand with Marvel, Blake, Shelley, and Garcia Lorca, rather than with innovators like Mr. Jackson. I do not wish to bring dishonor upon my tribe. And of course they had to take the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. Because you could take the First Amendment and say that I have a right to say what I wish, but you had to take the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, otherwise you're going to be in jail. And people did go to jail. So that by the time that Tom and some of the others went before the committee, they had learned this. And there were other people. Ed Rolfe came out of Spain. He had fought briefly with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain, and he had also written during that period about Spain. But he came because his wife got a job in Los Angeles. So he came out so Mary got a job and Ed came, and unfortunately he died rather young of a heart attack because he was a wonderful poet. And who published these poets? Who published Ed Rolfe? And people like that? Well, they published on subscription. And there was a bookstore called the Larry Edmunds Bookstore in Hollywood. I don't know if you know this bookstore. It sold a lot of Hollywood stuff. And that had, his books had the inscription of Larry Edmunds Bookstore, but basically they were published on subscription. I know I had a copy of one of his books because my father was an artist, and I had a copy of it signed over to my father because there were some beautiful illustrations by Nia Nixon, who was a great artist. Anyway, about the differences with San Francisco, I suppose maybe other people should talk about those.
Shall we open it up? I mean, you've pointed to the film industry and the sort of the amazing economic engine, which was post-war LA, as being the thing that brought writers and poets out, but what about other kinds of
Well, one of the things that would be different would be that the poets here took the initiative to start putting out magazines. We simply didn't sit around and go like the East Coast is ignoring us and hoo. In fact, Tom McGrath started the magazine, the California Quarterly, which ended up looping around and becoming involved with the filmmakers who have been subject to the persecution of HUAC. That is, after they got out of jail, they said, well, we still want to make films, and let's make a film about a miners' strike in New Mexico. We'll call it Salt of the Earth. And one of the ways that the poets supported this was that California Quarterly actually gave a whole issue of the magazine to printing the script. Now this was important because once word got out that this film was being made, first they tried to stop it just being developed. Word went out to developing companies. If you develop this film, you won't get any more business. So Biberman and company said, well, we'll call the film when we send it to the lab, we'll call it Vaya con Dios. And they managed to get it developed. And then no sooner had they edited the film than I think it was shown in a total of 2 theaters in the United States. Before then, they weren't able to show it anymore, although it went on to become one of the 100 most important films according to the Library of Congress. So publishing the script in California Quarterly was not just sort of like, oh, we're going to do this and we're honoring you. This was the only way to get the story out of the script, because they published the shooting script in a whole issue. And about 5,000 copies of that were sold to the union to distribute, the Smelters Union to distribute to their membership. So, and after that, of course, by young poets who had worked with Tom on that magazine, then founded their own magazine, Coastlines. And I think this is one of the ways in which Estelle's book is really important, because it really does pull out, it extracts from those various issues important poems that were published in those magazines and gives you a sense of the trajectory of the work that was published and the variety of work that was published. There was also, by the way, Trace magazine. This gets forgotten. James Boyer May, whose phrase became the title of this, did a magazine from the very early 50s to the late 60s called Trace. And he was the first to publish addresses of magazines. Remember, there were a lot of little magazines being published, but there wasn't any yellow pages. I mean, if you were a young poet trying to figure out where do I send my work, there wasn't any internet. You know, you couldn't go on the browser, little magazines, and things would pop up. So James Boyer May began publishing in each issue of his magazine a list of the little magazines that he knew about, and pretty soon they went from 12 pages to 20 to 50 to 80 to 120, and so these were the first. This was the first of the directories. So Los Angeles really was the origin of this kind of networking. And by the way, if you don't think it made a difference, think of Larry Eigner, paralyzed from cerebral palsy in Massachusetts, writing letters to Trace. All right, so that's how far that magazine reached. It managed to reach the doorstep of a person who couldn't exactly move around a whole lot, and gave him access to a whole world. Maybe
Well, it was
somebody-
something-
yeah,
Go ahead.
Can I carry on the story? So these 2 magazines, California Quarterly and Coastlines, gave a voice against McCarthyism. They were also a place for innovation. And Tom McGrath and the group around him, Edwin Roth, Naima Raplonsky, Don Gordon, has been called fiercely experimental. And Tom McGrath himself, he was a member of the Communist Party. He was influenced in the 30s by a writer named Christopher Caldwell. He was a British literary critic, communist literary critic, who put together Marxism and Freud and shamanism. And it fascinated Tom McGrath. There were these radical anthropologists looking at native tribal religions, and this utterly fascinated him because he grew up in North Dakota in a farming family which for generations had been there when the Plains Indians had been conquered in the late 19th century. So in the early 50s, he got into a fight with a man named John Lawson, who's sort of the head cultural honcho of the Communist Party. And, you know, Lawson won the fight, McGrath was a dissident. He lost the fight. The Communist Party people could have cared less for shamanism or Freud or any of the stuff he was interested in. And he couldn't get published in Masses and Mainstream, which is the communist literary magazine. So that's one of the reasons he started his own magazine. And he also was working at Cal State LA. He got fired there for HUAC. But he continued, he began writing, this group was meeting in Echo Park on March Street. They called them March Street Irregulars. And he started a long poem, an epic poem on America. It's one of the great poems of America called Letter to an Imaginary Friend. He didn't know who his audience was, so he wrote to this imaginary friend. And it's autobiographical about growing up on this farm, about sort of starving as a teenager, you know, working with woodworkers, about Wobblies, about his joining the Communist Party, and about the Indians. And he wrote it for like 10, 15 years. It started coming out in the 60s. And he combined social justice interests with a real interest in shamanism. And he was interested in shamanism before Gary Snyder and the Beats. You have to understand, these ideas were coming out of anthropology through these sort of more open-minded left-wing poets into the culture. And he thought of himself as a shaman, and this whole poem was a kachina, which would bring on the next Hopi world, the fifth world, which is a better world than our world. So he got deeply into connecting. He thought he was correcting Whitman, who never criticized the mistreatment of the Indians in this country. But he was focused on the Indians and social justice. So that was his innovation. Don Gordon, his friend, also got blacklisted and lost his job. They were both interested in Freud, but Don Gordon was having bad dreams, nightmares, and he went to a psychoanalysis. And the psychoanalytic and the psychological effect on his poems, like one poem about a war, the people can't figure out why the war can't stop, because all these generals and soldiers have, you know, psychological issues, so they keep on with the war. And I think he really took off with his 1958 book called Displaced Persons, which to me is the best poetry book ever about Los Angeles 1950s, because it really captures the nightmares and the paranoia. If you had been committed, I mean, Don Gordon organized a union, and he's blacklisted. He can't even work in the industry anymore. And it gets his feelings. He incorporated Robertson Jefferson's Nightmares, Dreams, Freud, Psychology and Archaeology, and Social Justice. I mean, nobody in this country was doing this, and it was a free verse. And just the titles, you have to listen to the titles of the poem from Displaced Persons, give the feel of the 50s, and here are some of the titles. The Silent, The Dissenter, The Deportee, The Hunted, In the Gaunt Hour, The Silent Generation, The Neurotics. I mean, that's a sense of some of the things he was writing about in the 50s. And another great poem from the 50s was about the death of an architect, about the death of Richard Schindler, who was the great modern architect of Los Angeles, and who was a good friend of his. He was friends with Gregory Ain, the other architect, and they both designed his house. So he really connected with this modernism in LA architect, opening up the space, leading to all those suburban open space plans, because he was a modernist too. So you can see how innovative, I don't know, I can talk about how Naomi Raplensky was innovative too.
Well, the interesting thing is that people like Schindler, who was working here, and Gregory Ain, the architects, and then all of the artists who were working here. And these poets, McGrath and Gordon and Raplansky and Rolfe, they were connected to all of the artists in the city. Now they did eventually become connected to music as well, and eventually got into reading poetry with jazz the way it was being done in San Francisco. But in fact, the Schindler reference makes me think of Peter Yates, who was really a music critic, but he wrote poetry and published in Coastlines. And he and his wife set up something called Evenings on the Roof. And there's a book by Dorothy Lamb, I believe her name is, Dorothy Lamb Crawford, who wrote a book on the subject about the whole music scene in Los Angeles, because all of these great composers and musicians had come to Los Angeles. I mean, you've got Schoenberg teaching at UCLA, and you had Otto Klempener, who was conducting the LA Philharmonic. You had all of these great musicians, so they were playing music at their house, and in their house in the Silver Lake area. It was up in the top of their house, and it was called Evenings on the Roof because they were essentially on the roof. This was designed by Schindler, specifically for this purpose as a studio. So not only was there art, but there was music. But Julia was talking about the experimental quality of some of these poets, and Tom was told he should be really writing a certain way by the party, and he said, excuse the expression, but screw you, I'm not doing that, I don't write soap opera. And then he didn't do it, so he did what he wanted to do. But I wrote my dissertation at UCLA a long time ago on, in the English department on the 1930s and poetry of the 1930s, and Caldwell is in there. But there was a group of poets who published in a book, a journal called the Dynamo magazine. And Dynamo, William Pillen was in Dynamo, Ed Rolfe was in Dynamo. They were early, these are older people already who came to LA eventually, but they were writing. This magazine was a radical magazine which was very experimental. Kenneth Fearing wrote for it, Muriel Rukeyser wrote for it. It only put out about 5 issues, but this was some great stuff that was being published in the 30s. And so, and Kenneth Raxroth published for the New Masses. So let's not put down, Kenneth eventually came and wrote in San Francisco. So these people came out of that period with the same sentiments and the same interesting political sentiments, but also with some of the kinds of experimentation with film and music that they were interested in.
Wanda, I think I see you making some notes here.
Well,
Yeah.
I am making notes, but
Yeah.
I'm kind of out of the loop on this one because I was a kid and I watched the HUAC on television in the 50s when my parents would sit and watch what was going on, and I was sort of force-fed TV, Lucy and et cetera. I love Lucy, which I absolutely abhorred. But so I was outside the loop, and I didn't start to become of age. For example, I was made aware of the Beats because my parents subscribed to Life magazine. And so when they did that issue on the Beats, I was fascinated. That was the only thing on that issue I remember. That we always had Life and Ebony and whatever on the coffee table. And so I didn't really understand what McCarthyism was about until way after the fact. Okay, I started getting my education after I left home on the day after my 18th birthday. But I did, so I knew the names of some of the beasts that were in that article. I had heard about the Holy Barbarians when that came along, but to me that was a movie. Or, I knew in '64, I was privileged to, when I went to Cal State, take a course with Henri Coulette. And at that time, I learned about Jack Hirschman and Tom McGrath. So I'm really outside the loop on this one. I was part of the sort of flower child and everything that came later in the 60s, after the Watts riots in '65. That's when I started to become aware through my first husband, who was very much a political, about what real history was. Not only the real history of Los Angeles, but the real political history of the United States. I was absorbing that rather rapidly because he was teaching me about he knew more about black history than I did or that I had gotten from my parents. Access was the big difficulty for the African American community in South Central Los Angeles at that time, where racism and segregation was really still very strong here in the deep West, as I've come to call it, the deep West. And so when I went to my first trip to San Francisco, are we going to San Francisco with, I went. And going to the little clubs, in and out, because everything was so open. Not only in San Francisco, but in Los Angeles with the free press and going to what I call the dollar at the door donation parties. I began to absorb all of this information. And when Beyond Baroque started, that's when I first learned about the Black Mountain College, and what I could see in comparing San Francisco, what had gone on in San Francisco with what was going on in Southern California, was that we didn't have a heart. San Francisco had a center and a heart, and there were, you know, in the Haight-Ashbury, you could go up and down the street, you could walk, you could traverse San Francisco by foot, but you couldn't do that in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, you had to drive, you had to have a car. The freeways determined what happened in the literature that grew up here. I mean, I was, and as far as being a leftist or on the left, or, I mean, at 18, I was sitting up in Dorothy Healy's apartment arguing with her. You know, that's how I came to get my
Did she listen?
education. Grandma did, she tolerated me. She was kind, but she asserted her authority.
Oh, yes.
She definitely,
Should probably say who she is, just for people who might not know
Oh,
who Dorothy Healy was.
geez.
The head of
Where
the
do I
She was the
start?
head of the Regional Communist Party.
That's right.
For many years, she had a radio show on
On
KPFK.
KPFK.
There's one area that hasn't been touched on, and that remains to be researched by everybody here, is talking earlier about the groups of people that came to Los Angeles. Well, there was one large group that came to Los Angeles during the war from West Texas to assume positions in the defense industry, and these were African Americans. Chester Himes describes that scene vividly in his two novels, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, and In Dubious Battle. So there was a segregation, and
It's the quality of, in dubious battle is Steinbeck. It's the
Steinbeck.
quality of hurt.
the quality of hurt, pardon the quality of hurt. Those two novels about working in the defense industry. And there was a thriving black culture, including newspapers, in South Central. We know a lot about the jazz that was appearing there at that time, but we know very little about any kind of literary activity. The other group were the Japanese Americans who returned from camp after World War II. And they were scattered in different areas. And lately I've come across, because of my ties to the Japanese American community, their literature, which is largely in Japanese, published in the Rafu Shimpu and in small local neighborhood areas, neighborhood newspapers that were published in J Flats and Gardena and the Japanese area of West LA. This is virtually unmined, and of course it was sort of linguistically and racially and ethnically segregated from the larger literary art scene that was going on in Los Angeles. Plus, there's even a Spanish language art scene going on in East LA. Back in the teens, the Flores Magón brothers started the magazine Regeneración, which was eventually suppressed because of its radical politics. Flores Magón, in fact, died in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. His brother was sent back to Mexico. But magazines like that continued, and they all had big poetry sections. And these remain unresearched to this day. And again, this is something that didn't have any kind of interaction with the larger Los Angeles literary scene.
Well, actually, Richard, I'd like to, at this moment, call our attention to a hidden treasure that is in the special collections at UCLA. When I was doing some research on this book, I discovered that in the midst of all these other magazines that we've kind of mentioned, and by the way, so far we haven't mentioned two of the most sustained projects, which were Variegation and Recurrence, edited by Grover Jacoby Jr. But it turned out there was, all of a sudden I saw a reference to a magazine called Line. And 3 copies, and I thought, well, I'll take a look at it. And so one day I came here to UCLA Special Collections, and I'm looking at the issues, and lo and behold, I find a short story in there by someone named Hiroshi Kashiwagi called The Silk Kimono in the Vase, published in 1947. And it's a short story from the point of view of a boy watching his mother pack to leave for the internment camps. As far as I know, this is the first published literary piece about that, and it was in a magazine published here in Los Angeles. So he, by the way, went on to become a writer, and he did put out a book, but this story is not reprinted. in the sole volume, that it remains sort of this hidden, I think this hidden treasure. So this is the kind of thing, I do mention it in my footnotes here, but if anybody out there is interested in starting a publishing project to get this kind of work back into circulation, I think it would be, that would be the kind of thing Richard's talking about. The work is there, of course, along with people who are recognized, like Hisao Yamamoto, whose 17 syllables is a classic of that period, once again based in LA. So maybe we should move to the second question.
Yes, that's just what we're about to do. And I'm just gonna stand up here just for ease of everything. And ask the panel, what we would like you to do is in some ways elaborate on what we've been discussing. But one of the things that you have that everybody doesn't have is ties, connections to the figures that we have been highlighting in the programming that we've done and in the exhibitions that we've done. And so, you know, I know that, I know, Wanda, that you knew Charles Bukowski. You mentioned being mentored by Henri Coulette. I know that Julia interviewed Thomas McGrath for one of the first issues of On the Bus. I know that Estelle was in the generation of poets that we're talking about and that we're exhibiting. Paul isn't here, but Red Hill Press, Paul's press, Stuart Perkoff's works may not have been in print without the work that Paul did toward the end of Stuart Perkoff's life to make sure they were published. And Bill was starting Momentum Press. So there, you know, there are these bridges between you, your experiences as poets, as publishers, you know, as students. And I would really like you to talk about, and maybe we can start with Julia, about your direct relationships and ties with people, and we'd love to hear the juicy stories.
Okay, like Wanda, I grew up with Lawrence Lipton's book about the Venice Beats, Holy Barbarians. It was rather fascinating. But I went to Berkeley to college, and when I came home back, it was 1970. You know, I was just a little too young for the Beats, unfortunately. I mean, I went to one coffee house near LACC before I took off to Berkeley. Okay, but when I came back, I went to Beyond Baroque, and my first real reading outside, I mean, a real reading was with John Thomas, who, I mean, there were two important, I think, big poets, Stuart Perkoff, who died very young and unfortunately had a very bad drug problem, and John Thomas. And I did my first reading. I was terrified to do a reading. And I read, I mean, I'm very short. John Thomas is a huge fellow. I mean, he's very big. I mean, I'm 5'2", and he's about 6'2", and he's big. And he has this
Victorian.
yeah, he has this huge bass voice, and I'm sort of terrified. And it's at this, you know, Venice, somewhere on the boardwalk, you know. And it's mostly his friends and a couple of my friends. And I had a long poem I wanted to read about Anne Frank. It's from my first book, After What Happened. I wrote a long poem about what happened to Anne Frank after she was arrested. And I sit there and I quaked my way through this poem, you know. And he made some crack, you know. Oh, she's reading about Anne Frank, and I go, oh my God. You know, I mean, I got his book. It's called, Paul Evangelisti published both of these big poets. It's called Epopeia and the Decay of Satire. And I read Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and yada-da. But what really impressed me, well, I grew up with him in Berkeley. You know, I mean, Ginsberg would hang out at Robbie's Chinese Hot Rod on Telegraph Avenue. Everybody went to Robbie's Chinese Hot Rod. You know, you all hang out at the same restaurants and coffee houses. And you all went to the same demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations. Okay, so I grew up with Ginsberg, that thing. But we're back here, I'm being a poet. Okay, and what really impressed me about that book, which I read over and over and over, is that he liked Ezra Pound of all people. And he was the first poet, this big poet who likes Ezra Pound. You know, he has this poem about going to visit Ezra Pound when he was in an insane asylum, St. Elizabeth, in Washington, D.C. as a young poet. And that was fascinating. And then he has this amazing poem about Stravinsky playing in Hollywood Bowl, hearing it, you know, and he's talking these really intelligent poems, you know, about people like Stravinsky, and I could follow them, and it was like a high. You know, and another thing about that book, which really impressed me, was he was making fun of some of the Eastern religion thing. He could be very funny, making fun of some of the beach sticks about, you know, hitchhiking up north to San Francisco. He had a poem about that. He had a poem about going to see this Buddhist leader somewhere in the mountain, you know, and he's very funny. I mean, he was the only funny beat poet I knew. Over the years, you know, he was always this presence, this huge presence with this booming voice. And he had this sense of himself, and he was erudite. And he also had this very common American language. I found him amazing, and his work kind of amazing. I mean, okay, Philomena, who was his wife, Philomena Long was a nun. She was up here in Brentwood. She left the convent to get involved with Stuart Perkoff. At the end of Stuart's life, I met her maybe 10 years later. She was making independent films. She was a poet. She was always wearing black on the boardwalk. She had this incredible style, Irish Catholic, you know, always in black, these sort of bangs around here, but you know, you all know her. And we were sort of friendly, and I was teaching here at UCLA in the extension writing program, and she and John Thomas were very poor, living in Venice. I mean, dreadful poverty, and she called me up and said, could you help me get a job at UCLA Extension? I said, sure. So we got together, and I said, you do this, you do that, you do that, you do that. She got the job, which is really nice, because then they had some income at the very end of their lives. And I got laid off, but she kept her job. Okay, so that was my experience with the Beats. Okay, with Tom McGrath, my first publisher, John Crawford, he had been in the Communist Party, he had left it, and he was starting to publish these older generation people who were dissidents, like Tom McGrath and Meredith Lasser. Meredith Lasser, she had a 30s radical, and then she was ignored in the blacklist period, and the feminists brought her back. And after sort of Crawford really saved her novel, The Girl, and got it out in the world, she was actually making money for the press. So Meredith Lasser, the money that she made for the press, helped publish a bunch of new young poets in the 80s. So thank you, Meredith. Okay, I mean, seriously, it was making money. Okay, so Crawford was in town in spring of 1984 when my first book was coming out. And he said, one of the poets I published, Tom McGrath, got fired from Cal State LA, 1984. This is 1954, 30 years later, he's coming back for his first reading, you know, at Cal State LA.
It wasn't Cal State LA then. It was Los Angeles State College.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Because Cal State LA, then we got Cal State.
Okay, then we got Cal State LA. He says, go to the reading. Lonnie, you were there. You were at the reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wanda was there. My friend
Wanda.
Wanda was there. And
Wanda,
we
were
said,
you there?
yeah.
I was there.
Yeah. So, and then, okay, so I went to that reading, and it was pretty, yeah, he was there. You know, Native American poet who was working here as an editor for a Native American publication here. Okay, and then they had a party for him. His friends from 30 years ago who sort of suffered through the blacklist together and put out these, you know, magazines together, they had a party, and I went to that party, and it was wonderful. It was just astounding. These people were just terrific. It was like, it was a high, that party. I thought it was great. I thought I'd fallen in love with him. I mean, seriously. But my father had just died, and somebody says, you haven't fallen in love with him, just relax. But I asked to interview him, and he said, sure, you know. So we met at Berrigan's in Echo Park, and I put out my little tape recorder, and I asked him some questions, and he just took off. I was interviewing for the first time in my life a major American poet. I mean, it's an astounding, it was all him going on and on and on. He was making fun of Ginsberg. He was saying Ginsberg did a long poem in Howl, 10 pages. I'm writing a long poem, 400 pages. You know, I mean, it was this long fight they had, McGrath group versus the Beats, you know. And he was still digging them a little bit. You know, and it was just a great interview, you know. And after that interview, I got it published. And then I had to, you know, I was tired of being poor all the time, so I went back to UC Irvine, and I had to do an MA thesis. So I did it basically on contemporary American working class poets and Tom McGrath. So I could research all this stuff, which is one of the reasons I knew it. It's sort of a high researching it, you know, anyway, that's it.
So like, man,
Yeah.
have you read this cat stuff? Like, he's a believer, man, dig. You should really hear this. And he shuffles the papers at me, Paul does with deep admiration, kicks back and renders me speechless, his gray eyes tearing. The words sing of bird, holiday, dolphin. So like, man, this cat is legend, should be as famous as anybody. Was there at the beginning, like when the beat thing was really happening. He believes in the muse, man. He believes. What's that, I ask? What's what? What is the muse? Like Greek, man, Erato, the god, woman, lover of lyrical verse, man, dig. You should meet this guy. He's pure. Bring some of your stuff. The cat is beautiful. You'll see. So we go west to Venice for the hang. We find him in the back of the big space filled with empty folding chairs and a handful of acolytes rattling around the mic. Paul slobbers all over himself, making with the intros. The man is frail, bent, not as old as he looks, ill and perhaps dying, I've heard. His long salt, but mainly pepper hair tied back in a long, slim ponytail, white hands trembling. Paulie most something recently written. What'd you think, man? What'd you think? The beautiful cat leans into his cane with one hand, holds out the other. Let me see it. He takes the poem and reads it closely, smiles, returns it. Not bad. Keep it up, Paul. She's a poet too, man, like amateur, but she's trying, dig. Can you look at one of her pieces? Just a minute if you don't mind, she's got it right here. I go into my purse and shyly hand him a couple of pages. He reads them and smiles. Word eyes glitter. You've got something. But she needs work, doesn't she, man? Paul says, doesn't she need work? Find your mentors, young lady. All great poets have their mentors. Paul and I go outside and stroll the broad walk in contemplation. Paul is restless and upset. Did you hear what the cat said to you back there? Did you hear that? Hear what? He liked your shit, man. He really does your shit, man. I know the cat. He never talks to me like that. Like what? He said you got something. Come on, are you jealous? Hell no, man. I just wish he'd respond to me the way he responds to you. Forget it, Paul. Besides, I don't believe all that muse stuff anyway. It's a lot of hooey. No, man, no. How can you say something like that? The muse is for real. I know. And it's so goddamn hard to create without her. You know what I mean? Like inspiration, like from above. He took an exaggerated look skyward. It's just that if I waited around for some muse, I wouldn't get much done. I don't know about you, man. I don't know about you. You shouldn't say things like that. Huh? That's sacrilege, man. Sacrilege. I don't tell him I don't know the meaning of the word. When we get home later, we make love, and afterwards I go and look it up in the unabridged while Paul is snoring. Paul is poet Paul Brooks. The instance occurs in 1973, and the beautiful cat is Stuart Perkoff.
I met Bukowski and John Thomas when I was 16 years old. There was a small bookstop near where I lived called the Dialogue Bookstore. It was on the corner of Fulton and Burbank Boulevard opposite Bowery College. I had a flyer in there that was going to be a poetry reading at a private residence. I think it was near Echo Park. It turned out to be John Thomas's house, though I didn't know it. So I went there with two friends, on a Sunday afternoon when we went to this reading. And I knew who Bukowski was. I never had seen him before. But there was a guy sitting on the floor, leaning up against the wall, drinking Brew 102 out of a paper bag. And that's an old Los Angeles beer that's no longer made. It was like 26 cents the can. Anyway, and next to him was an old Webcor reel-to-reel tape recorder. It wasn't old back then. Anyway, John Thomas, who I also didn't know, got up, and our next reader is Charles Bukowski. And the guy sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, pressed the button on the tape recorder and recited his poems. He pre-recorded his poems so that he could keep drinking through the meeting. And I knew him because there was another magazine. It was called the Black Cat Review. You know that one. It was co-edited. It lasted just a few issues, and it was co-edited by Bukowski and Ely Tchaikovsky. And I used to get it at that very same Dialogue bookshop. So after the reading was over, Bukowski was sitting on the floor drinking, and I had the temerity to go up to him and ask him. I said, "What does it take to be a good poet?" And he looked at me and he said, "Kid, you have to know how to drive all the horses at once."
You have to know how to drink brew one.
Actually, Richard, I think the magazine you're thinking of was called Laugh Literary,
That's
or Man the Humping Guns.
Yes, something like that. Yeah.
And in the one of the poets published, I think, in the third issue was a young poet who just arrived from San Francisco, Paul Evangelisti, and that was his sort of introduction and becoming involved in the LA literary scene. One of the things, although I think we're here to talk about Los Angeles, I think it's really worthwhile to remember that the traditional sibling rivalry between San Francisco and LA in terms of, in many terms, athletics and poetry is largely PR. Back at that time, many of the poets were moving back and forth. The poet we've spent a lot of time talking about, John Thomas, for instance, ended up moving from Baltimore, heading towards the West Coast, and intended to go to San Francisco, but I got a ride all the way to LA and stayed in Venice West for many years, then went up to San Francisco, and that's actually when he first began sending out work to be published in magazines like Kayak, which was coming out of Santa Cruz, and then he returned to LA. Another poet who moved back and forth was Bruce Boyd. Jack Hirschman lived here first in LA and then moved up to San Francisco. Bill Margolis, who was very good friends with Bob Kaufman. There are actually pictures in the archives of the Temple of Man of Kaufman and Margolis hanging out together on street corners in San Francisco. Bill Margolis moved down from San Francisco to LA and stayed down here the rest of his life. So in certain sense, to talk about a San Francisco Renaissance or an LA Renaissance is to get too local too quickly and to forget that it really was the West Coast poetry renaissance. As Kenneth Rexroth said at the end of an essay in 1957, not only is the avant-garde not dead, it's jumping all over the place. That was Estelle joined in the chorus there, right? And when he meant that, he didn't mean just San Francisco. He meant jumping all over the place. He certainly meant jumping all over the West Coast. Maybe not, it wasn't happening in Kansas or Nebraska yet. But.
Even in the 50s, people were moving back and forth between San Francisco and Los Angeles. Ginsberg was a great admirer of McGrath. And he used to love to come down and listen to McGrath read, even though McGrath, when writing a little review of Howell, said he thought it was a bad poem. But he did say that when he heard it read aloud, it sounded a lot better when Ginsberg was reading it than when he read it on paper. But then he decided, well, maybe it still wasn't a good poem. And then Kaddish was the great poem. So that was it. But in fact, you know, I was only about 11 years old when California Quarterly, so I'm not that old, but you had me back there somehow. But I was about 16 when I met McGrath, and I was starting to write poetry. And my father was an artist in LA, and my father hung out with some of these other artists who hung out with some of these poets, and so they all knew each other. And Burt Myers, whom you probably should know if you don't know, a wonderful poet in Los Angeles who wrote for Coastlines. He ended up teaching at Pitzer College, but he never got a PhD, and he in fact never got a BA and a high school diploma, but he was completely self-educated. He was a student of McGrath's, but he worked as a gilder doing frames at the Landau Gallery. He was a professional gilder. He did a lot of other kind of work. Tom and he believed in working with your hands, even though they were both incredibly well educated.
I met Bert Myers I used to run into him all the time near LACC.
That's when LACC was where he hung out. He used to hang out in the coffee shop. He didn't go to school
Was
there.
that what it was? Because there was a group that hung around Henry Miller that I was aware of, and they used to invite me. But
What year
I
are we
never
talking
went.
about? We're talking about a little bit later?
We're talking a little bit later. We're
Yeah, a
talking
little
about
bit
the
later, but
70s,
in the
70s.
50s, he was hanging around in coffee shops, and, you know, we were, it was new in Los Angeles to be reading poems in coffee shops. They may have been doing it up north at a faster pace, but the coffee shop scene started about in the 50s. And I remember reading at a coffee shop, my own stuff, I was just a kid, and I'm reading this poem, and this old guy came up to me and said, women shouldn't write about that kind of stuff. And I didn't say anything to him, but you know, as I thought about it later, the poem that I was reading was probably a poem called The Shape of a Pear, which begins, the shape of a pear is too much like a woman's torso to be eaten in public. And I think he didn't like the sexual references. He thought maybe we should be writing about dishes and
Does
children.
anyone here know about the bridge?
Oh, the
Hollywood, the bridge
Yeah.
place,
Yeah.
the counterculture had? Because I hung out there, I went there, but I went there through music.
Yeah.
Because I used to perform, I started out to be a musician, a pianist, or concert violinist is what I wanted to grow up to be.
Well, you
Another
know,
life.
you know,
But there was a group of women, Judy Seal, I think, who was originally from Canada, a woman who would end up being my future mother. I didn't know she was gonna end up being my future mother-in-law. And Bonnie White, who was the daughter of Kitty White, the singer Kitty White, who was the coach, Elvis Presley's musical coach in film. And so there were about 5 of us. There was a woman named Natasha with this flaming red hair, and there were 5 of us who, after the men got finished with their business, we would hang out afterward at the bridge around the fireplace. The bridge was also where I think Bukowski did one of his early readings.
Yeah.
And then I was hanging out, well, John Thomas was of course my mentor. He used to loan me his first edition to take home. And he made me promise not to get roach eggs on his books and bring them back nice and clean. And he would, after I would read the books, we'd sit and talk about them, you know. So he gave me some of my early education about Pound, Olson, and some of the small presses across that did this beautiful work that I had never seen or heard of. My brother was living in his basement at the time. That's how I came
that's
to
how you
meet
got
John Thomas, and Charles Bukowski told me, you should meet these wild, crazy white guys, you know, up here. And yeah, George was living with Rose and John. This is my little baby sister right here. So that's how I came across. And at the bridge, there was a shootout between John Thomas and Charles Bukowski. One poem and one shot of, I don't know whether we're drinking Wild Turkey or Jack Daniels, but they brought in the bottle and each poet had their poems. And there would be one poem and one shot, and one poem and one shot. And the winner, the best poet, would be the last man standing. I was the only female in the room. You know, I'm sitting up against the wall, and I mean, the place is just jam-packed, you know, you can't move for all the bodies, you know, mainly young males in their 20s. You know. And so it's going like that, you know, Bukowski reads and I know John's my mentor, so I was on his side, you know. But as I sat there, I began to see that Hank was the better writer. You know, and so I was starting to say, you know, and so it went on about an hour past, and pretty soon one of the poets liquefied and flowed from his chair onto the floor. It took about 6 men to carry out John Thomas. You know? And Bukowski kept reading and taking shots. One poem, one shot. One poem, one shot. And then at the end of the reading, he rose and he picked up his poems and tucked them under his arm and he marched right out that door into the night. I know.
Should we open things up to the audience? Who has a question for the panel? Pardon?
I was just saying, I'd love to see that recreated in the film.
Yeah,
The way she described
Computer generated.
Yeah, go ahead.
I got here a little late. Did any of you guys talk about Curtis Zahn? Is he
Oh,
somebody
Curtis
who's
Zahn.
considered
Yeah.
was he, I mean, he was a playwright, he wrote fiction.
Yeah, Curtis published in Coastlines. And, matter of fact, someone was talking about the world around Los Angeles, and there's this wonderful poem that he published in Coastline called Tijuana. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's how I found him in your book, and then I've since, gotten my good library. It seems like there's a collected poems sitting in a
Yeah,
desk
he,
drawer somewhere that never got published.
yeah, and, the wonderful thing, I like the first lines of, a wire fence makes it Mexico, but God has never been asked, and the vegetation does not change its citizenship overnight. Now there's Los Angeles, Tijuana,
Yeah.
and, no, he's a wonderful one.
He was a good painter too, by the way.
Huh?
Curtis Zahn was a good painter.
And he left his house as sort of an artist residence, I believe,
That's
right?
right.
I know that Laurel and Bogan,
Yes.
they stayed for a while in his house.
Right.
And-
By the way, Zahn's poem is having a renewed life. There's a book coming out from Lawrence Goldstein from the University of Michigan Press sometime either later this year or early next year, which is going to include about 60 different poems about Los Angeles from different periods. And Curtis Zahn's Tijuana poem is going to be one of those poems. And in fact, if anybody knows, I'm in touch with Lawrence right now, if anybody knows where he should go for the copyright permission, that would be helpful. That is always, of course, one of the problems when you start to do this kind of, I would say, reclamation work is people die and families get scattered, and how do you locate the people who can actually
It's very
say, give
difficult to
permission?
find the right.
Sometimes you do have to say at the beginning, we've made every honest effort to contact people. Please step forward if you have a claim and we'll help you out. For instance, I know that Don Gordon's daughter is still alive.
She's still alive.
And I hope that we can get her a copy, by the way, of this videotape, because I know that she would be deeply moved by how much we've talked about her father. So that would be, by the way, we talked a little bit about it, wanting about the issue of jazz, and it's been mentioned a little bit. I think the poet's relationship to jazz was really important. I mean, here we have this relatively obscure Venice West poet, Paul Brooks mentioned just now by Wanda, but I think Paul was sort of very famous in our community back in the days for having a huge sign in his window that had the quote, "Charlie Parker was a great electrician who went around wiring people." and everybody knew, and when you walk past that house in Venice, okay, that's one of those poets over there, right?
Well,
That was-
Stuart Perkoff is the brother of Simon Perkoff,
Who's
who's
a jazz-
married to my cousin, who is,
Who's a jazz
yeah,
musician.
he is a jazz musician, still is a jazz
Mhm,
musician
still is.
in San Francisco.
Yeah, he scored the documentary that Bellamy made about.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Beat documentary. Interesting.
And his son became Simon's son became a musician too.
I'm going to do a couple of things now. I want to say just a brief concluding remarks because we are going to move into the reception and I'm hoping that you can carry on the conversation. You can talk to people individually and face to face and enjoy the refreshments and also buy books. But I do want to say before we transition into the final phase here that, one of the things I've been thinking about during the discussion is that it's really important that our history isn't ephemeral, that it isn't fleeting, and that it doesn't disappear. I'm really glad that we are recording today, because partly what we are all trying to do, I think, in one way or the other, is to document this history. And one of the things I also wanted to mention is that in the process of doing this work, starting with Mural's invitation last year, is that for me, in doing research and in talking with all of you, that the history is starting to come alive in certain ways. And we are involved in sort of not just reclamation, but revivification. And I would like to mention that Mel Weisberg was here yesterday for the program that we had.
Yeah, good.
And we got a chance to show him the exhibition that's downstairs that represents all that we're discussing. Mel Weisberg was the editor-in-chief of Coastlines magazine. I'm not sure how old he is, but we got a chance to talk, and he is also a UCLA alum. He went to undergraduate school here, and he had broached the topic himself of bringing his papers here. So the next time we meet with him, I'm gonna have a chance to look
It's
at
amazing
his
how many
archive.
UCLA connections.
I know there are a lot of UCLA connections, and when Emily and I were working on the exhibit, we even thought of having a display case that was devoted to that. I also want to mention that in the process of working on this, I spoke with a friend, Garrett Hongo, some of you might know, a marvelous poet. And when he found out what we were doing, this is last year, he said, well, are you interested in my teacher, Bert Moss? Unless there's, you know, a sort of a burning statement that somebody feels they need to make to the whole gathering, I would like to invite you to. Yes.
I wanted to just mention a woman who was very involved with all this, Naomi Raplensky. She came originally in '46 to work with Brecht, who is here as his translator. She went back to New York. She published her first book with a major press in '51 and came out to New York and was in the McGrath thing. She's still alive, and she's about 94, and she's still doing readings, and her collected poetry just came out. And it's amazing.
It not only came out, but it
won an
won
award.
the Poetry Society of America Award for 2013. And I'm wondering how Naomi feels about this, because when she was very young, she was nominated for the National Book Award, and she did not win it. I think that year Marion Moore won it.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of talk about she didn't win it because of her politics. And
Yeah, anyway.
she, yes,
Another thing is,
wonderful lady, wonderful poet.
what was she doing out here? She was very poor in the 30s, but when she came out here in the 50s, she put herself through UCLA, as well as write poetry, you know, and work. So it's another UCLA
It
collective.
is,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But
And
if
Don
you get,
Gordon went to UCLA.
yeah. So if you ever get a chance, Naomi,
We have
someone,
his oral history.
she's finally getting her recognition at 94, 95, and they call it the Poetry of a Free Woman, and it's quite amazing. She's also either bisexual, well, she was involved with Richard Wright in the 40s, and then she had a longtime woman partner for many, many years. And she's written both love poems for men and women, and she also wrote a gay rights poem for Oscar Wilde as her, but she writes on many, many different things. But it's something, I would encourage you to get her book, Naomi Raplensky's Collected Poems.
It's a beautiful book. It's published by Godine Press, and it was a long time in coming. A long time in coming. Both Bert's son and I kept writing, trying to get her to. She said, I'll get to do it when I die. She's still alive. She'll be 95 in May.
So I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you.